Hi, everyone.
Hello there. How are you? Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
Right. Let's see if we can. And if you are joining us, I should be able to figure out how to mute everybody, but go ahead and mute yourselves if you haven't already. Yes. And we'll get started here in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to make sure everybody is first entered in. Everybody has a chance to show up. Dr. Eller, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Letting you know that.
Good idea, Darren.
I might need that. All right. And for those of you guys just joining us, we'll be starting here momentarily. I'm just waiting to give everybody else a chance to show up.
And letting everybody know we are going live on Facebook and YouTube right now. In fact, that's where the majority of our attendees will be showing up.
All right, we're still waiting just on a few more people, I think. We are almost at capacity here, so. And I am working out a small kink that Zoom is having for me, so I'm going to try and fix that while we're still waiting.
Did you share my screen, Darren?
David, no, I'm sharing my screen. Are you able to see it?
Oh, I get it. Yeah, I see. I see what you've done now. Okay. Thought that was me.
All right, guys, we're going to start here in about 30 seconds. I am busy trying as fast as I can to admit as many people. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome, everybody, to this special Meet the Author event. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I will be hosting this webinar. I'm so happy that you've joined us and that you have this incredible opportunity to hear one of the world's foremost scholars on cultural anthropology and the anthropology of religion, Dr. Jack David Eller, who was kind enough to be here with us to talk about his new book, Trump and Political Theology. Now, it does look like we have a full crowd for this event. In fact, I think we are almost at capacity for attendees. So don't worry if you can't see yourself on the screen. The Zoom seems to randomly select who it will show and who won't. Now, just so you know, this event is being sponsored by the Global Center for Religious Research, or GCRR. And as a special thank you for joining us, GCRR is offering you $4 off the retail price of Dr. Eller's book, Trump and Political Theology. Simply go to the link at the bottom of the screen, gcrr.org. Then click on Dr. Eller's book, and then enter the promo code IFollowEller at checkout. The promo code has no spaces and no capital letters. It's I Follow Eller. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Eller. He is a world-renowned anthropologist who spent a year in Australia visiting Aboriginal communities. He then went on to attend Boston University, where he earned a PhD in anthropology after another year studying cultural and religious change in an Aboriginal society. He has taught at the university and college levels here in Denver since 1990, and he has since written a number of college course textbooks on cultural anthropology, anthropology of religion, secularism, and violence and culture. He now serves as the head of global anthropology of religion at the Global Center for Religious Research. Now, as Dr. Eller presents, feel free to write any questions you might have for him in the chat box, and he'll do his best to answer as many questions as time allows at the end of his presentation. And so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jack David Eller. You have the floor, sir.
You see my presentation now?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, good. All right, thank you, Dr. Slade, for that introduction and for arranging this event. Thank the Global Center for Religion Research for publishing this book so quickly and so professionally, and for all the support that has been given. Thanks to you for attending this event. Over the last actually five, if you count the 2016 campaign, there's a number of words that we've heard and used repeatedly in regard to Donald Trump, such as unprecedented, unheard of, outrageous, abnormal, exceptional. And it was the last of those words that sparked an idea for me, because if you're familiar with Carl Schmitt's political theology, he builds his entire understanding of sovereignty and political power on the concept of the exception, the exceptional. And so I began to think about Trump in terms of Carl Schmitt's theories, in terms of political theology, which is of all the different angles that have been explored in terms of Trump, that's one that I think has been somewhat overlooked. So that's the nature of this discussion. Is Trump an exception? To the extent that he's an exception, what does that teach us? And how can we think about not only Trump, whose time is theoretically over, but about American politics and about politics and power in general? and even about political theology and theology. How can we reform those to make them more relevant for the current era? Love him or hate him, and those are pretty much the only two options. Trump has given us an unprecedented, once again, look under the hood in the same way that, say, abnormal psychology reveals a lot about the workings of the mind, or a broken down car makes us think a lot more and learn a lot more about the workings of our engines. Trump, as an exception, has thrown off the veil of a lot of American politics and the nature of power. In that sense, Trump is sort of the anti-Wizard of Oz. That is, instead of telling you not to look behind the curtain, he has torn down the curtain inadvertently. I don't think that was ever his intention, but he has shown us or given us a glimpse into the machinations of power in a way that probably no contemporary American has had before. So, as I said, almost exactly 100 years ago, 98 years ago, Carl Schmitt, a German political scientist, really changed political theology by making it more political and less theological, by asking, where does power come from? And he said that it's not the power that makes decisions possible, but that the decisions make power possible. And that would seem perhaps a little backwards to us. But if you are not familiar with his work, or if you are, then the very first sentence of his book is this: sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So the two key words here obviously are decide and exception. And by exception, he doesn't mean things like natural disasters, those kinds of emergencies. He's talking about really when can the rules themselves be set aside, and what rules can be put in their place. Who has the power essentially to say the rules don't apply, and to say what the rules will be from now on. And he said that it all comes down to the decision. So the questions for us are, what is the source of power? Where does power come from? What is its legitimation? And what are the limits of power? What constrains a potential sovereign? On the assumption that in a democracy, we really don't want a sovereign. And in fact, Schmitt was rather unhappy with Weimar Germany, that there wasn't sovereignty. He was, as many people were in the late 18 and early 1900s, rather jaundiced about democracy. And in fact, in our modern democratic system, there really isn't sovereignty in Schmitt's sense of the term. And I'm not sure that most of us want it, to tell you the truth. But his general thesis is that power is not created or defined or limited by law. And we tend to think that it is. We want to think that it is. I think that we have very much discovered, to our chagrin, to our sometimes our horror, that presidential power in America today is not limited by law, unless the president essentially accepts those limits himself. He said himself, Schmitt, that law is, he would say, that law is created, defined, and limited by power, the other way around, and by authority. That is, law is authored, and of course it is, whoever you think that author is, and therefore authorized. That author has or gives itself or seizes the right to make the law. So essentially, the ultimate source or sanction of law is not in law itself. In fact, we could think of law as a rather Gödelian system, which cannot complete itself and which cannot justify itself. There's always something outside the law, above the law, under the law, on which the law depends. And of course, there's a variety of possible answers to that question. The traditional one is, of course, the supernatural. That's the theological part. I don't know if you can actually see my pointer, but I'm pointing at the religion. That's the theological part of political theology. The classic notion of political theology is that God or the gods or some source or another are providing the rules and the justification for the rules. Those rules exist. Those rules are right because the God, the gods, the spirits, the ancestors, whatever, say so. That's, of course, one possibility, but it's not the only possibility. So there are various ways to look at the theological side, and I'm going to actually argue in a little while that theology and theological is not quite the right word for this, because that implies, in fact, it specifies gods, and many of the world's religions don't have gods at all. That's one of the lessons I've learned in my anthropological career. And of course, many of the religions that do have gods don't have law-giving gods. That's a very unique and recent kind of religious system. Anyhow, the classic approach, again, is that the spirits or some kind of supernatural beings make the rules and then put the leaders the human leaders in place, choose them, authorize them. In the extreme, where the gods rule themselves in some manner or another, we would have, an absolute theocracy. But of course, the gods are never present, so they always have to rule through someone. And so, as the little graphic shows, the familiar Western version of this was the divine right of kings, that whoever happens to be the king has been ordained by God, and that gives that king or queen the right to rule. It makes their decisions by definition correct, and also makes any opposition to them illegitimate. The problem always arises when that particular king or dynasty falls. Then, of course, the divine right of the kings has to pass on to some other dynasty or to some other individual, which then claims that same mantle again. The same general idea, of course, in China, if you're familiar with the mandate of heaven, that as long as the heavens select and support the emperor, then that person again has the right to rule, and that's the end of the discussion, hopefully. That's not, of course, the only way for a political theology to work. For example, the leader may him or herself actually be a divine figure. Most European kings never claimed that, but say, as I mentioned, the Egyptian pharaohs would have said that they were literally gods while alive. Either always gods or deified once they take office, and therefore the office of human and God are combined in one being. And once again, there is no way to question that authority. There's no higher authority to appeal to, because they are the author. They are the sovereign. Farther afield from theology, from theism, are ideas about leaders having supernatural powers or qualities, characteristics, like, for example, the Polynesian idea of manna, which is, according to Raymond Firth and other observers, is sometimes a noun, sometimes a verb, sometimes an adjective, but it's something that gives the chief more efficacy, more energy, not only over society, but even over nature itself than any other humans. And of course, things like failing at war or the crops failing would all be signs that their manna is weak or missing, and therefore someone else has that manna. Someone else then has the right to rule. And of course, a little farther away from the leader, him or herself, having that kind of power, it might be that the rules have typically been laid down in some way by supernatural figures. So we might have written records of laws, and then a job of, say, the judges or the king, or the follower in the footsteps of Muhammad would be then to obey those laws and transmit those laws. Again, that's all really classic political theology, but of course, in America, for the most part, none of those answers are going to really solve the problem. And most of them we never even think about. I don't think anybody really considers any American president, including Trump, to be a superhuman or a divine figure, or even necessarily to have supernatural qualities. So there are other possibilities, say especially since the 1600s or so, Thomas Hobbes and subsequently, about where law might come from. That is, there might be natural law, some law in nature that is simply the reality of things, and those laws are immutable, irrefutable. They're just the way things are. I think most of us would probably have a problem with that, not the least of, as anthropologists, of course. For me, the problem is that different societies have different laws and very different conceptions of law, and therefore nature as a constant that wouldn't really be able to account for that diversity. Another possibility is reason, and that is, I think anthropologically and philosophically another difficult position to defend, that we can somehow reason ourselves to the correct law. Seems like rational people have come to some quite different conclusions about everything from abortion to speed limits. In fact, there's nothing in natural law that says anything about speed limits. So natural law can't possibly provide, again, the complete legal system, nor can reason. And in fact, Schmitt was rather adamant that the facts can't lead us to law. The law is not about facts at all. In a democracy, strictly speaking, and we'll talk about the difficulty of defining and operationalizing this, law comes from the people. Ideally, the people are sovereign, and the people can choose the laws. That presents a number of problems, not the least of which is, how do we know that those laws are right? Obviously, at one time, at least in certain parts of America, slavery was entirely legal, but probably most of us wouldn't say today that it was ever right. And also, people can disagree rather profoundly about the law. And if the law comes down to a 50.1% majority, then it's also rather, I'm not going to say illegitimate, but it's always questionable. And the law can always change. Just parenthetically, Dr. Slade mentioned that I did my fieldwork in Australia with a group called the Lawbury. And sometimes in English, the word that's used for their traditional culture and religion is the law. They'll refer to that as law. And they found it absolutely unfathomable that the law could change. In fact, they told me that was just insane. The law is absolutely eternal. And of course, they're using it in a very different sense than we are. But the one thing I think that most Americans would agree on is that the law is not eternal in any way whatsoever. And that it can change by, a simple majority vote any time of the day. And of course, a la Schmitt, law can come simply from the will of the leader. The leader can say, this is the law, I am the law. Or of course, as Louis XIV said, I am the state. And that's what the law is going to be. And that is, again, Schmitt's idea of absolute sovereignty, which we don't recognize in America and have rather, fearfully avoided in America. And even the idea that the people are sovereign is kind of a difficult question. And again, we'll talk about that in a number of ways in a minute. So again, Schmitt quotes something which is said roughly in the same words by Hobbes, actually, in Latin, that authority, not truth, makes the law. And that's actually quite relevant for the present moment, because we've seen an awful lot of untruth over the last 4 years too. So truth is not it's not an obstacle to the law, and nor it's necessarily a foundation for the law. And that's troubling, but it's actually not surprising once you think about both Schmitt, the history of political theology, and simply how politics works. This again is actually Schmitt's words. Authority proves that to produce law, it need not be based on law. In fact, I think he would argue, and I think I would agree, that it can't be based on law. Law can't be based on law, and authority can be based on law. What is the authority of the law? If you think about, for example, the Declaration of Independence, by what authority did they declare independence? I'm sure that the British Crown didn't accept their authority to do that at all. By what authority did those men draft a constitution? Who empowered them to do that? So the question never goes away as, who are these guys? Who gives them the right to do that? And this is where Schmitt gets a little more theological in his political theology. He says all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. I'm not sure I agree with that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I don't agree with it. In fact, in my book, I actually, in one of the later chapters, reverse that relationship. To say actually a lot of the significant concepts of religion are actually spiritualized secular political concepts, like, for example, the sacred nation. But we'll get to that if we have time tonight. In one particular way, he says sovereignty is like religion, and the sovereign is like a god, in that the decision sort of comes down from heaven. The decision, he says, is analogous to the miracle. You don't see it coming. You never know what's going to happen. You never know what form it will take. It simply erupts into society. It is, if you're familiar with Eliade's theories of religion, it's a hierophany. It's the appearance of the holy in our world. And it is that eruption, whether it's a miracle or a decision, that makes the law and makes institutions. So again, we might ask, why do we have, 3 branches of government? Why do we have a bicameral Congress, legislature? Why do we have an electoral college? Well, somebody decided that. And it became law, and it became institutions, and here it is. We can change it, of course, and there are those who think that we should, but that's always a difficult process. And then the question is asked, who are we to change it? And what should we change it to? And we've opened up the whole political theological can of worms again. So we know, and this is, again, by design, that the executive, the presidency in America, is a very, very powerful office. And this puts it in a number of tricky positions. And we're seeing one, here in late December of 2020, that the executive, the current administration, always gets to oversee its own reelection. And that is interesting. It would be interesting if there was some neutral third party to do that. But of course, we would have to create that. And then that would have to be authorized and legitimized in some way. Who would those people be? And why do they have the power? So, for example, we're all too aware, for example, that, Trump has been trying to overturn the election since it happened almost 2 months ago. Just a couple of days ago, Rasmussen said that Pence at the congressional meeting in a week from today, should actually reject the electors. And this is a moment to think about the exceptionality and what we've learned about it. Americans are most Americans, I like to think, are fairly aghast at Trump's attempt to overturn the Democratic election. However, by design, and most Americans didn't know this, even I didn't know, perhaps in quite as much detail in terms of the timing, there are a number of steps built into the system at which some agent can overturn the decision of the past agent. So, for example, we know that the state legislatures must accept and certify the popular vote, and they can refuse to do that if they want to, legally. And if they do certify it, the electors then can overturn the certification and vote a different way, entirely legally. And if they don't do that, then, as we know, a week from today, the Congress can overturn the decisions of the electors entirely legally. So what prevents them from doing that? I would say only a couple of things, and they're very fragile. One is a belief in the democratic system, so a desire not to do that. In fact, maybe even not an awareness or an unawareness, you could even do it, that it was possible. But if you're aware of it, if you know that the law and that each of those steps is really intended to allow you to reverse what happened before, and you don't believe enough in the system, in the democratic system, in the popular vote to respect that, then what stops you? I would say about the only thing is fear. Fear of, not getting reelected, fear of losing support, fear of losing your job. But if you don't have that, or if you're more afraid, say, of, losing your base than, going against the popular will, there's really nothing to stop you. The executive also enforces the laws, as we know, and if it happens to be the kind of administration that potentially breaks the laws, that also puts it in a rather contradiction. And again, I don't want to get into the argumentative politics. I don't want to talk about all the potential cases, but we've probably all heard of the Hatch Act. And there's a great number, in fact. Ivanka Trump, it was just in mid-October, apparently over a 2-day period, violated the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act prohibits political officials from doing politics in their office, from being politically partisan, that she violated that act 8 times over a 2-day period. And Kellyanne Conway, of course, many more times, and lots of other officers. In a perfect world, those people would be arrested and they'd be in jail. But of course, if it's the executive that's breaking the law and the executive enforcing the law, that's not very likely. Who can do anything about that? Nobody really, not without, essentially revolution or mutiny. There's nothing to be done. Presidents can grant pardons, as we've heard and we've learned, kind of to our consternation. The power to pardon is virtually unlimited. That power was not meant to be used personally or politically, but it can be, and who's to stop it? Nobody. So we've seen in recent days Trump giving pardons to political allies and friends, people who not only were convicted, but often confessed to crimes. And they're pardoned, and that's the end of that. And there's no way to reverse it. Here's a case of very near sovereignty. And of course, one of the ultimate acts of sovereignty is literally to suspend the law, the Constitution, and declare martial law. And that always is a potential power of an executive. And we've heard talk about that. I'm sure you've all heard this recently. Michael Flynn has urged Trump to declare martial law, to either hold another election or to just nullify elections. And other leaders of his movement have said that maybe he should invoke a law. Again, this would be perfectly legal to invoke a law to essentially, abrogate the law. And that would be an act of sovereignty, but it would be a legal act of sovereignty, which is what makes sovereignty really interesting. Would there be pushback? I'm sure there would be. Would the army actually obey? I don't know. This could be a case for mutiny, which actually proves, I think probably contra Schmidt, that there's never any such thing as absolute sovereignty. There's always the possibility of revolution. There's always the possibility of the military or the lords, the nobility, somebody rising up and saying no. So you're a sovereign until you're not. So the question for us again is, and this is the question of the book, is Trump an exception? And if he is, then what does that tell us about today's and tomorrow's democracy in America and beyond? I start the book by talking about some actually existing American political theologies, and there are a number of them, both historically and currently. I think it goes without saying that there is a very strong stream of Protestant Christianity in the United States, which is a clear self-identified, self-contained political theology, sometimes claiming political power, sometimes happy enough to play along with democracy, but it is very much a source of political theology in this country. And if you're familiar with the sociologist Robert Bellah back in the 60s, and this concept of civil religion, he said it's not Christianity so much as this, he said, distinct religion. It's a theism of a certain kind, which does the job of political theology, of providing that solid ground, of giving American institutions and American laws, American decisions, American actions like declaring war, a supernatural sanction, so that we're sure that they're right. And also giving us a standard to judge our own laws. What do you judge laws against? What do you judge policies against? This civil religion, and an invocation of the word God, but never with anything specifically Christian like Jesus or anything. So that would be another political theology, actually a second political theology, Bellah would claim, in parallel with Christianity. But most Christians would hear it as Christianity. But Bellah maintains it's really not. Benjamin Leonard recently introduced an interesting term, which he called Republican with a small r theology. This is the theology for republics, for countries without kings and royalty. And obviously America had to, he says, devise one of these fairly quickly. And even maybe before America, England was already thinking about this a little bit. The idea is that liberty comes from God. Always that's kind of the end of the question. For the United States specifically. So liberty is God-given, but a society can only exist as long as the individuals in it have virtue. And of course, they mean Christian virtue. And circularly, only a virtuous society, only virtuous citizens can be free. So Christianity becomes a built-in part of the individual freedom of democracy, of a republic at least. So you couldn't really have a successful republic without religion, or at least without Christianity. Christianity and religion being the same thing for them. The interesting thing about Republican theology, he says, and this is actually, I think, supportable by lots of specific cases in history, is that it tends to very much respect the Constitution, sometimes almost to the point of, sacralizing it. So the two things that are really common in Republican theology are a love of the Constitution, or an appeal to the Constitution, and the promotion of small government. That is, low taxes, minimum regulation, no redistribution of wealth, all the kind of stuff, that we know and love, especially from Republicans today. All of this is meant entirely to maximize individual freedom. And that's what God wants. So of course, that's what it should be, but only for individuals, with virtue, which would mean, only for good Christians. So what we see in the history of America from early on is an idea that the Constitution and small government and freedom go along with religion, Christianity specifically, very seldom Judaism, almost never Islam, and nobody even thought about Hinduism or Buddhism or, Walbury, religion. As I talk about in one chapter, America has, along the way, of course, spun off a number of actual literal specific political theologies, most of them, again, more political than theological. I talk about Mormonism briefly, and Joseph Smith's explicit idea of theodemocracy. Joseph, they refer to him as Joseph, did not claim to be establishing a theocracy. It was a theodemocracy. It was a democracy so that people could use their wills to make laws, to organize society, but always under the guidance of God, which means essentially indirectly, from God. And that the U.S., either all of it or at least a part of it, would be a Christian kingdom. So that really is a classic case of political theology. And while it's unhappy to think about it, the KKK is another example of political theology. Interestingly, not as theological early on as it became in the 20th century, which was mixing, once again, American nationalism, religion, and race this time, and sometimes class as well. There you see, going back quite a ways, America First is quite an old slogan in America. One God, one flag, one America, and one Führer. Christian identity, if you're familiar with that particular movement, which claims that essentially the Jews either never were God's people or somehow lost that position, and that white people, originally, Anglo Israelites in England, became the true Israel. And then when that came to America, white Americans became the true Israel. And so Christian identity is white American identity. Or if you're familiar with dominionism or Christian Reconstructionism, which essentially wants to rebuild America on religious Christian, specifically Old Testament law, on the premise that all of the law has already been given, and therefore we don't need any human law. In fact, they would do away with things like prisons because that's not in the Old Testament, and most crimes would be punished by death anyhow. So the law comes from that source. You will notice, unhappily, that at least the bottom three, I guess probably all four of these groups, have been amongst Trump's staunchest supporters, which is, I think, instructive, but also fairly alarming. And there is, on occasion, literal theology going on in the Trump administration too. I mean, around it, you've probably actually seen people who think that Trump, if not God himself, has been chosen by God and somehow doing God's work, which is about as inconceivable as almost anything could be, given how unreligious and really unchristian an awful lot of his actions are. So, for example, you might have seen this in recent days. Here on Fox Business, that the Trump team is saying that Jesus wants the election overturned. Well, there you go. If he wants it, if God wants it, then I guess you have to do it because that's where the sovereignty is. And so we should do it. And Pat Robertson said that not only does God want it, but he's going to make it happen. If the state legislatures don't do it, If the Electoral College doesn't do it, if the Congress doesn't do it, God will step in. I'm not sure, or some other day, and overturn the elections. And it's already underway, apparently, because the angels have already been sent. Why they're coming from Africa, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know. I didn't know that was the base of angels. But Paula White, one of the more interesting characters in the Trump orbit, says that the angels are already on their way. And I guess, I don't know if they're carrying ballots or exactly what they're doing. But, literally, God and the angels in heavens are at work in the election, if not beyond. And there was a Pew study fairly recently that found that around a third of Americans actually think that God is somehow involved in, Trump's administration. Happily, only 5% at the top level there think that God actually approves of his policies. Most Americans who think that God planned for Trump doesn't like his policies, which makes you wonder why he would plan for Trump. But on the other hand, 29% also thought that God planned for Obama. So God apparently, is bipartisan or changes his mind or something. And as the sovereign, it's his right to make the decision. So I guess he can do whatever he wants. Notice happily that almost half, 49% in both cases, said that God's not involved in politics at all. So there is no really theological political theology. And 16% don't believe in God at all, which is quite interesting. So anyhow, there are lots and lots of different threads of political theology in America. But I want to talk more about the politics than the theology. And I'm going to actually, again, try to reform the theology at the end of our presentation. So is Trump an exception after all? He certainly sometimes acts like he's a sovereign, like when he said that he could, tell the states what to do, when he really can't. Is that a matter of ignorance of presidential power? Is it trying to seize more power than he has? We can't read his mind. But early in his administration, he did say this: let me tell you, the one that matters is me. I'm the one that matters. I'm the sovereign. Because when it comes to it, that's what the policy is going to be. That is saying, I make the decision. I'm the sovereign. Carl Schmitt would say, there you go. There's sovereignty at work, or at least an attempt at sovereignty, an attempt to seize sovereignty. He's an exception in a number of ways, obviously, but most of these are more quantitative than qualitative. He's the oldest president, until Biden takes office. The richest president, the least experienced president, having never had public office or any kind of public service. But again, those are more, again, quantitative. All presidents have been fairly old, and they've all been, relatively rich. He's not a normal politician, but that, of course, is his appeal to many of his followers. The whole point of 2016 was to break the system, was to put somebody who wasn't just, a Washington insider, not just another, lifetime bureaucrat into office. So sometimes exception is good, at least from a certain point of view. And of course, his style, every day, all day, has been non-presidential, non-traditional, outrageous, exceptional. Breaking all the norms and traditions, insulting people, calling names, being profoundly uninformed and proud of it. You've probably all heard that, he doesn't read and refuses to read. Dishonest, to the point of, promiscuity, and disdainful of all other powers. And again, that is exactly what a Schmittian sovereign would be. Someone who says, I don't really care what the Supreme Court says. In fact, I'm going to pack the court if I can. I don't care what the Congress says. I don't care what the state governments say. Those are all sovereign kinds of actions and talk. So he speaks and acts as if he is, or thinks he is, or wants to be an extra constitutional sovereign, ignoring Congress, or sometimes, lately bad-mouthing Congress, including his own party, calling them weak and other things like that. Criticizing his own agencies, from the Department of Defense to the Justice Department, and as we said before, claiming that he has ultimate say over the states, which he does not have by constitutional rule. But again, you have as much power as you can get away with. In a number of important ways, though, while Trump is extreme, he's really not an exception. I want to argue that most of the things that we consider exceptional are, again, quantitatively different, more, but they've been kind of on the radar for the last several decades. There's been a steady growth of this, at least since 1980, if not before. So the claim that Trump is an outsider, while it's partly true and partly false, is actually almost nobody who's more of an insider in terms of being part of the the big picture, the international movers scene than Trump. He is East Coast elite. He's the very kind of people that his supporters often hate, which is curious. But America tends to like the outsider over and over again. We tend to go for the outsider, so that's nothing new at all. Trump's appeal to Christians, evangelicals in particular, is nothing new whatsoever. In fact, you all probably know that Trump, I haven't seen the 2020 numbers, but in 2016, he won almost 80% of the evangelical vote. That's pretty much exactly the same amount as Romney won, and as McCain won, and as George Bush II won. Well, when you hear that and you say, oh boy, that's really unusual. It's not. It's absolutely standard Republican, electorate. Having Billy Graham or whoever near the White House is absolutely normal stuff. Nixon had Billy Graham at his side. Nothing new going on here at all. His policies of taxes and regulations are absolutely Republican boilerplate. If anything, he's kind of achieved what Republicans have always dreamed of, probably because of his disregard for all the other norms. But this is absolutely normal stuff. Even his isolationism and hyper-patriotism. In fact, there are those who've said, and I mentioned this in the book briefly, that Trump not only goes back to Reagan or Nixon, he goes back to Andrew Jackson, that a lot of his policies are Jacksonian in being kind of populist and being very, American isolationist. Even his signature slogan, this "Make America Great Again," I hope you all know is nothing new whatsoever. Ronald Reagan ran on almost exactly the same slogan 40 years ago, except he said, "Let's make America great again." It was an invitation and not an order. But it wouldn't resonate if it wasn't familiar. That's the whole point. A lot of what Trump is doing is extreme, but it's really not all that new. And as we remember from Nixon, if you're old enough to remember Nixon like I do, by the early 1970s, there were those who already thought that the presidency had gathered too much power. And Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book, I think in 73, about the imperial presidency, saying that presidential powers, partly because of the recurrence of war, partly just because power tends to, centralize over time, that the presidency has steadily grown in power, at least in the last 100 years. And the tremendous powers already in the presidency to appoint judges and treaties and all kinds of other things, and pardons, as we saw. Yes, 73, that Schlesinger already said that Nixon was acting like an imperial president, and Reagan more so, and Bush too even more so, and now we're almost to the point of a sun king. What's interesting is how many new devices, non-constitutional devices, presidents have thought of in order to give themselves more lawmaking power, like executive orders, executive agreements, which are essentially executive orders between countries. They're treaties that presidents can agree to without having to get ratification. Administrative directives, things happening within the agencies, all kinds of other things, and of course, creating an agency or shutting down an agency, or as actually Reagan kind of invented, Bush II advanced, and Trump has kind of perfected, starving agencies, just not funding them, not staffing them, until they can't do their work. And this is one of the scariest ones because it really is sovereignty. Bush II, I don't know if he invented this, but again, he developed it very far, what are called signing statements, which is when a law came to him from Congress, he would sign it with this statement that said, I accept that Congress has passed this law, but I'm not going to enforce it. Essentially claiming, and again, I mentioned in the book some specific language about how this works, where the president says that you say it's the law, but I say it's not. Essentially, the president claims the right to decide what is law and what is not. And that is sovereignty, or as close as sovereignty as we can get. So that the president would actually say, okay, it's the law, but now it's not. I'm not sure many Americans are aware of this power or how often it's been used. But the executive, as again the law enforcer, can simply not enforce the law, and then it just as well might not be there. Moving beyond Trump himself, Trump is not much of an exception, because what he is and what he's doing is actually rather common in the world, as I'm sure you're all aware, and we should all learn a lot more about. There is a tall wave of right-wing populists, individuals, parties, and in many cases governments, in Hungary, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Russia, in Poland, actual serving executives who are right-wing populists, who do the things that Trump does, only more so. Populism is not always right-wing. In fact, probably it was originally left-wing, the people's parties and things in the late 1800s. But today it's predominantly right-wing, and the right-wing populists have adopted much of the language and the agenda, interestingly, of the left-wing populists, which is kind of fascinating. Takis Pappas, a political scientist, defines populism as the idea that sovereignty belongs to the people, whatever that is. So it's democracy, but the institutions tend to get in the way. The people should be able to immediately have their way, and institutions often interfere with that. And of course, this people is assumed to be the majority of the society, the real people, to be unified, to be homogeneous, and of course, therefore, have to have the right to rule. Therefore, this kind of populism is always exclusionary. It excludes, immigrants. It excludes minorities. It excludes the elites. Often, the party operatives, the party system. Those are not the people. So, for example, the kind of things we see in populism are this desire for direct contact with the leader. And Trump gives them this with his tweets. Many people think this whole tweeting business is silly and trivial, but it's not. He was quite explicit that he wants to be able to talk directly to the people without having the media or the party or anybody else, in between, interpreting his message, distorting his message. This is, again, standard populist kind of stuff. That the leader essentially embodies. This is all kind of a medieval idea that the king's body is literally, the people. And so the people and he are one and the same. And a big kind of energetic, moving, kind of scary body is always a really effective kind of populist device. And of course, everybody else, which means, of course, all foreigners, liberals, the establishment, the parties, the institutions, usually the legislature and the courts, of course, the media, and any opposition parties are just trying to undermine the people. They're against the people somehow, because only one person, only one party can actually represent the people, and that's him or her. And therefore, there is no possibility of debate. There's no possibility of disagreement, of loyal opposition. And populists, wherever they are, Hungary, Brazil, tend to be nationalist, isolationist, traditionalist, civilizationist. They see their entire civilization, which is, Western or Christian or white or whatever, as somehow at risk of being lost. Just a list of some populists going back 30 years. Alberto Fujimori in Peru is a classic case. And all of these people achieve power through legitimate elections. That's one of the normal ways to do it. Once they get into power, they begin to, of course, accumulate that power in sometimes extra constitutional, non-constitutional ways, and sometimes in much more egregious ways than Trump ever has. So just to quickly mention what the script includes. Again, democracy often is the path to power. Again, quite honestly, whether it's Hitler or Bolsonaro or Putin, emphasizing the same kinds of threats. Foreigners and immigrants and liberals and elites are the enemy, and they're out to get you. And they've already taken your power, and they've already taken your money. So you better, get behind me and resist them while you still can. Once they're in power, of course, because there is no possible legitimate opposition, then the press has to be muzzled, the courts have to be corrupted or just ignored. The legislature has to be, minimized or sidelined, all opposition condemned, and in really bad cases, arrested. That's one thing, at least, that hasn't happened in the Trump administration. And there's been no talk about rewriting the Constitution, thank goodness. But there have been claims to, to save the nation, to make it great again, to save it from, the Chinese or the liberals or the secularists or whatever. Of all the current right-wing populists, probably the most theoretically articulate is Viktor Orban of Hungary, who says explicitly that his goal is not liberal democracy, but illiberal democracy. And probably for most people, most Americans would think that liberal democracy is simply, redundant. Liberal means democracy. Democracy means liberal. But that's only one kind. Again, democracy could even be theoretically, the Soviet Union or North Korea. They claim to be democratic in the sense that the people rule or somebody rules in their name. But illiberal democracy is a different kind of democracy in which the people and the ruler have absolute power. And anything else, including laws and constitutions and institutions and traditions and norms, all are interfering with and limiting the people's sovereignty, if that's designed to do that. So there is actually a growth of this weird kind of democracy, illiberal democracy. And one of the interesting, and I think it's problematic for some people, aspects of liberal democracy these days is its universalism. That is concept like universal human rights. Everybody has the same rights. In places like Hungary, it's very clear that, native Hungarians have the rights. And if you're not a native Hungarian, you really don't have the rights. And in America, certainly, immigrants, at least undocumented immigrants, really don't have the rights. And at the extreme, some would say, and whether Trump ascribes to this or not is arguable, that maybe only like white people have the rights. But the idea that it doesn't apply to everyone, so not everyone just because they're inside the border, that's part of illiberal democracy, that some people have more rights than others. So populism is, in fact, a sort of a kind of twist on, a permutation of, a corruption of political theology, and that it's the nation that's sacred. And again, this doesn't necessarily have to come from religion. It might go to religion. And of course, the leader is the savior. And what's funny is, in every single country, it's the same message. France is great, Netherlands is great, Hungary is great, Brazil is great. Populists seem to have an affinity for each other across borders, but their interests, I don't think they ever noticed this, really clash. In other words, what's good for America is not going to be good for, say, Chinese populists or Hungarian or German populists, because we're protecting ourselves. So they think that they're kind of, allies, but they're really not. They're ultimately enemies, or at least competitors. And of course, decisions are almost divine in the sense that nobody can tell the leader, certainly not legislatures, certainly not traditions, certainly not courts, certainly not institutions, tell the leader what to do. The people are good, the leader is good, the opposition is evil. And of course, we have almost faith in the leader. We know that Trump at times has seemed to demand loyalty over anything else. And disagreement is heresy. It's blasphemy. I'll just mention this very quickly because our time is going very rapidly. I do push the analysis even beyond current populists to 20th century populists and authoritarians. Now, what's interesting is that I think that we are so far removed from the mid 20th century that most of us obviously have no living memory of the populists, the authoritarians, the totalitarians of the mid 20th century. But there are those who did. In fact, there was you probably know, a whole burst of literature in the 1950s about totalitarianism. And so I talk about this to give us an even deeper context for Trump as an exception or not one. Erich Fromm kind of started this, probably actually written even obviously before America joined World War II, and maybe even before World War II was really fully on because of the lag in publishing, but that people don't really want to be free entirely. They want to, give up their will to a stronger will. In fact, in a later chapter, which we can't talk about tonight, I actually invoke Schopenhauer and his notion of will, that the world is really a will, or it was the product of a will. In fact, there's been a couple of books written just recently. One was just published around the same time as mine about strongmen, doing the same kind of analysis about comparing today to the 20th century strongmen like Mussolini in particular. So again, I won't go into them in any detail, but I talk about in one chapter these 4 particular books, all written within 2 years of each other. And the second and the fourth, authoritarian personality and true believer, are actually both about the followers of a populist or an authoritarian. And the first and third are more about the leader. But in both cases, people saw this happening, 70 years ago. And a lot of what they say is absolutely germane today. In fact, it could practically be written about today, to give you a couple of quick ideas. Especially in the first on the list, the prophets of deceit. The agitator, they call him, is a con man. He's never telling you the truth. He's a huckster, he's a salesman, he's a carnival barker. He's a snake oil salesman. Of course, the authoritarian has little use for truth. Truth is almost always not on their side. And so they have to at least ignore it and at worst assault it. And that should sound kind of familiar. Of course, anything that contradicts them, they say, that's just hoax, that's just fake news, that they dismiss it in some way. That's absolutely, again, standard stuff that's been going on for 70 or 80 years. The world comes down to friends and enemies. And what's interesting, in another piece that Schmidt wrote, where he was trying to define or get to the essence of politics, he said the essence of politics is the friend-enemy relationship. And gee whiz, I hope not. Because when politics, say in America, goes from competition, opposition, to enmity, that is, the Democrats are not just the rivals of the Republicans, but the enemies, and not just the enemies of Republicans, but the enemies of good, of God, then it's pretty much all over. And again, emotional appeals without a lot of substance, with almost no answers. And they all point out that populists and authoritarians tend to be aggressive and rude and vulgar. Partly that's kind of one of their populist bona fides, that they are like the people, they talk like the people, just as rough as the people. But it's also another way of trampling kind of norms and institutions and such. And of course, they all assert that the regular institutions of democracy don't really help the people. They've either stopped working or they've actually turned against the people, because there are corrupt people in power, or foreigners have gotten in power or something or other. But pretty much always, the legislatures, the parties, they're all either not working or they've actually literally turned against you. I'll just summarize this really quickly, because Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist studying contemporary American politics, said that there seems to be this deep story in America that is really aggravating Trump supporters. And the story goes like this, that there's a line of people kind of wanting their share, and you're patiently standing in line and you see other people cutting the line. And those people happen to be another race, immigrants, from the East or West Coast, from California. And, you want people to, have stuff, and you want to, share and all, but this is not fair, you don't think. And then, in fact, you see Obama, he's not only, allowing the line cutters to get in front of you, but he's the line cutter himself. Ouch. Who the hell is this, black guy? How did he go to Harvard? And so this kind of resentment about other people getting it before you, when you've been here first and you worked the hardest and all that other kind of nonsense, and they've taken it from you. And this, I think, is actually really important for contemporizing Schmidt, because I think for most Americans, sovereignty is not really the issue. Most Americans don't worry about sovereignty. Maybe the only place we talk about sovereignty is, say, in multilateral organizations like the United Nations. But most Americans aren't really worried about losing their sovereignty. They're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about losing their incomes. These days, if they're smart, they're worried about losing their lives. And they're worried about losing their country. So this kind of sense that America is being lost and that America is losing, that is what, of course, it energizes, Trump's reference to winning. Remember how he would talk in 2016 about how we would win until we were sick of it. And so that's really what Americans want. They want not so much sovereignty as just stability. They don't want precarity anymore. And I don't think that's something that Trump or any president actually can offer. You can talk about it, but there are bigger world historical kind of processes going on, like the rise of China, like big tech and things that simply make the good old days, unlikely if not impossible. And of course, evangelicals in particular have felt like, they've been losing the culture wars, whether it's, gay marriage or abortion or whatever, for the last 60 years. The whole talk about culture wars back in the 90s seems almost quaint now, because it's, almost turned into open, civil war. And of course, they're willing to even accept a morally flawed leader. In fact, you probably have maybe asked yourself, and maybe you've even seen some of the answers about, how could evangelicals get behind someone like Trump? Especially when even 10 years ago, evangelicals overwhelmingly said that an immoral person could not be a good leader. And in recent years, the majority have now come to the position that an immoral person can be a good leader because, fortunately, they have an immoral one who is a leader. They can actually, once again, appeal to theology and say, well, Trump is kind of like one of those flawed biblical prophets, or even, Cyrus of Persia or someone who, he's not a very good person, but yet he's doing God's work for us. God has chosen a flawed vessel intentionally just to show how wonderful God is. So they actually find some kind of virtue in the fact that he's so unvirtuous, which is wonderfully contradictory. But it shows you just how, productive this kind of theological thinking can be. I wanted to talk a little bit about Trump's lying. I have a whole chapter on his lying. Given our time constraints, I won't indulge that. But I guess hopefully we'll be posting this presentation so you can look at it. And of course, there is a chapter on this. It is, one of Trump's most distinctive features. Everyone lies. All presidents lie. Of course they do. And sometimes for good reason. Anthropologists like me and social scientists in general, realize that lying may be pathological too. But it's never just pathological. It is action. It's a performance intended to achieve something. And therefore, I introduced the term agnomancy to refer to this kind of action. There is a kind of growing, it's been around for 20, 30 years now, field, the study of ignorance, agnotology. But here we're talking about not studying it, but creating it. That is, either making people doubt the facts or giving them, alternate facts, false facts. So literally conjuring or creating ignorance. And by ignorance, I don't mean stupidity. I mean literally not knowing things, like not knowing that there's a virus out there, or not knowing that the virus is deadly, or not knowing that a mask, can prevent, or at least, give you some protection. So that kind of ignorance. Again, sometimes we think that this is unintentional or pathological, but I think that probably MAGA coach Brendan Dilley said it, and I don't know if he meant to be quite this blunt, that he doesn't care about the truth. He's not trying to tell the truth. He makes shit up. He doesn't give a fuck about the truth. And why doesn't he care about the truth? Because, factual discourse, true propositions are not his agenda. His agenda is to destroy. He wants to destroy Democrats and destroy liberals. And if that involves, some kind of stupid lie like Pizzagate, or QAnon kind of conspiracies, that's fine, because the goal, the end is much more important than the means, and truth is never ever the issue. So I talk in the chapter about a number of ways that agnomancers can do this, and this kind of study actually was first done, pioneered in corporations, especially tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, to a certain extent, to governments. We could also apply it to religion. Any social institution is going to do a certain amount of, ignorancy creation, like book burning, or killing heretics. That's a kind of agnomancy too, to keep those ideas or that knowledge from being shared. So question the facts. And of course, question the scientists and experts, badmouth Dr. Fauci, badmouth the CDC, badmouth the National Institutes for Health, vilify them. I saw just the other day that I guess Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio was saying that Fauci lied about some percentage when science simply adjusts its numbers. It's not lying. Simply don't let the facts get out, suppress the facts. And one way to do that, of course, as we talked about in the Reagan years and the Bush years, is to undermine the agencies. So don't fund the agencies that collect facts. Don't allow agencies to, enforce regulations, so they don't even know what's going on. Obviously, get your own experts. That was the trick that the tobacco companies would do, is hire somebody to say, all that research is wrong. I've done research and cigarettes are fine. In fact, cigarettes are good for you. And some of them actually did say that. So doubt and uncertainty. In fact, one of the, I think it was Eric Michaels, said that the title of one of his books is Doubt is Our Product. Tobacco companies actually said, yeah, we sell cigarettes, but really what we make is doubt. And if people don't really know if cigarettes are dangerous, then they'll go ahead and use them. And we can always say, well, the knowledge isn't really in, the data is not in, or it's so complicated. There's other factors, or it's really how you use it. It's your own fault. There's lots of ways to make it doubtful. And agnomancers like corporations or Trump throw up this cloud, this fog of uncertainty, this fog of unreality in which they can operate freely. That's the whole point, is to create freedom of action. And of course, your own conspiracies, and simply just lie and just bullshit. And according to the famous study on bullshit a few years ago, a bullshitter doesn't know what the truth is and couldn't care less. For example, if you know that a vaccine is not coming before November 3rd, and you say it is anyhow, that's just bullshit. It's not even a lie. It's just bullshit. But of course, there's real points to this kind of thing. Many of his followers think that this is very genuine. He's not going to, say what other people want him to say. He's not going to, bow down to them. He's willing to say what other people are too afraid to say. And of course, this is a show of power. There was an interview with, the interviewer claimed that it was Karl Rove. Rove denies it. Who said that, the government and the Republicans are an empire now, and they make their own rules and they make their own reality. And you guys, by which I mean me guys, journalists, scholars, we live in the reality-based community where we just study what they do, but they really make the reality. And that's kind of where I want to go with this. Of course, making lying and non-reality more common and more palatable. And unfortunately, paving a path for this, blazing a trail so that you get, other Trump-like, literally QAnon here in Colorado. We had a QAnon candidate win a seat in Congress who, buys all that stuff about, literally, Democrats eating babies and stuff. It's frightening. And of course, so wearing down the institutions that there is no opposition to any of this kind of stuff. And ultimately, just creating your own reality. Showing that he can bend it to his will. And again, this is the Schopenhauerian aspect of sovereignty and of Trumpism. Doesn't matter what's true today. What's true is what's important is what will be true tomorrow. And tomorrow, maybe, there will be a vaccine, or, they will have, Democrats will eat babies or something. But they're trying to make this reality. And I mentioned in the book that what's kind of fascinating about this is that we're so fascinated by it. When, social scientists have known since the 60s that reality is socially constructed. Anybody who's read Berger and Luckman, and I'm sure that Trump hasn't, knows that reality is socially constructed. We've just never seen anybody do it with so little shame before and so much success. To just say, I don't care what's real, I'm going to make this real. And if enough people go along with it, I guess it becomes real. It will have been true someday. Politics is never about truth. It's always about getting things done. It's about results. It's about making the world. And of course, religion is one way to make the world. And this is kind of the last thing I want to say in our waning moments. Political theology in general, of course, is very theistical. It's very specifically Christian. In fact, there really isn't anything, at least according to many Islamic scholars and Muslims, like Islamic or political theology quite. We need to make political theology not only less theological, but certainly less Christian. So what I do in the last couple of chapters is to try to move theology beyond, or political theology beyond Christianity. In fact, beyond gods at all, and then beyond even some of the important other Christian concepts. For example, Christianity tends to really ignore and denigrate things like myth and ritual, Protestant Christianity in particular. But that, as anthropologists, we know that that's not a good thing to do. Those are still very powerful things, including in America. Myths are not just stories, and they're certainly not just false stories. And if they were, that really wouldn't, diminish their power anyhow. Myths are narratives with power that tell us how things began and why they ought to be the way they are. They're about how the world came to be. They're doing exactly the work of political theology, of telling us, who was the author, what's the authority, what's it supposed to be, and what are we supposed to do about it today. In fact, one of our founders in anthropology, Bronislaw Malinowski, said that myth is not a story. Myth is certainly not meant to be true or false. Myth is a charter. Myth is a blueprint, a guideline, which again makes myth referring to the past, but really talking about the future. What are we going to be? Well, there you go, what we were, where it came from. So the past tells us who we are, where we came from, which is where we're going. And ritual is much the same. Ritual is certainly not, meaningless action, or the meaning is not really the point at all. Ritual is action that, again, gets things done. It changes things. Religious ritual and political ritual, and they can be religious too. So Robert Bella's point was that political rituals in America, like inaugurations, will invoke God. But there's plenty of political rituals that don't. And plenty of political myths that don't. But again, they all, tell us who we are, and they give us reasons to do what we're doing or what we're going to start doing tomorrow. Chiara Boccici, a scholar of political mythology, said that it's not a proposition to prove. It's not to be subjected to true and false analysis. That's not the point. It's a prophecy. We're trying to make it so. And I think if we see, Trump and populists in general as not trying to tell you what's true today, because most of what they say isn't true today, but what they want to be true tomorrow, I think we see them much more realistically. America has lots of myths that are not religious in any particular way. Our Manifest Destiny myth, our City on the Hill myth, sometimes America as Israel myth. And populism itself has a number of recurring myths. Here's 4 key ones, and this is not my original thinking. I mentioned it in the book. The conspiracy myth, somebody's out to get us. The unity myth, that, really all of us people, the real people, all agree. And of course, the others, they don't agree, but they're not real people. The myth of the golden age, make America great again. We used to be great, and we can be again. And what's making us not great? Well, that conspiracy right there. And of course, the myth of the savior, that some individual is needed, a Trump, a Jesus, a Mussolini, somebody to come along and save us. And of course, all this, ignores the myth of the people itself, that there's such a thing as the people that has one voice and one will. That's probably not true. And in democracy, almost never true. People have lots and lots of different opinions about things. So what I argue at the end of the book in the final 2 chapters is that Christianity and theism, in fact, in general, is perhaps not the best kind of political theology. There are other, even religious ideas out there that might be more appropriate, more descriptive of the current moment, interestingly. And a lot of these are pre-Christian. For example, not all societies have gods, and I talk about this a lot in other things that I've written. So, if you're looking at the second column from the left, theism's at the bottom. And there's various kinds of theism and then various theistic religions, but most of the world's religions never had gods at all. Or if they did, gods were a small part of the religion, or they were nothing like the God that we know in Christianity. They weren't all good, they weren't all knowing, they weren't all powerful. Sometimes they were rat bastards, quite honestly. Often they were just, remote, they were uninterested. At best, capricious, and at worst, just uninterested. Part of the problem with Christianity is that its God is so omnipresent, so totalizing. It tries to introduce way too much stability into politics and into the world, into society. And if there's anything we've learned in the postmodern era, it's that society, reality is not very stable. I really want to tell you a quick little story, although we don't have much time for it. In the early 1800s, there was an event in the Pacific Islands, which is known as the Great Polynesian Iconoclasm, in which on lots of islands, the people tore down their traditional religious buildings and they threw away their traditional religious objects and adopted Christianity. Many people at the time and since cheered that and said, oh boy, there's conversion to Christianity. It wasn't. It so happens that there was a tradition in Tonga and Hawaii and places like that every year at a certain time of year, they would tear down their traditional religion. And then at another season, they would build religion back up again. So this tearing down of their traditional religion was absolutely traditional. It was a tradition to be anti-traditional. And then it was a tradition to build another religion, usually the same one again, but in this case in the 1800s, Christianity. But what people expected was the next year they would tear down Christianity and build something else, maybe Christianity, maybe something else. They discovered that that's not how it works. Once Christianity is established, it never leaves. It's absolute, totalizing. There is no moment of relief from it. And they found this really, really burdensome and really surprising that Christianity never lets go. That's not how other religions work, and it's not how reality works. So I propose a couple of other religious models from other religions that are more descriptive of today's reality. The shaman and the trickster in particular. The shaman is, we often think a healer. And that, that's fantastic. That's one thing that shamans tend to do. But how? Why can shamans heal? The power comes from their ability to take multiple perspectives at the same time, human and spiritual, this world and the other world, living and dead. They can change. They realize that the world is multiple and in flux, and even in chaos. And that, I think, describes our world a lot better than any kind of, totalizing stability. And of course, the trickster is chaos incarnate. The trickster loves to break things, but the trickster also makes things. He's not evil. He's free and a little bit, antisocial. But he's antisocial in the sense that he is outside the law and makes the law. Whether he's a Prometheus or a Hermes or a Loki, he's productive and creative, even as he's destructive. I would never say, some people have said that Trump is sort of a trickster figure, but I think that understanding that there are other models besides the Christian God for how a sovereign might work and how politics might work is really beneficial. I also mentioned briefly maybe another mythical creature, the troll, and I'm not the first one to say this, as kind of a model. Somebody who, again, more gleefully and kind of, cruelly likes to break things down. The trickster is not usually cruel. He's usually kind of absurd. People tend to laugh at the trickster. But the troll is usually not very funny. At least he finds himself funny, but nobody else does. So last, Michael Frieden, who I mentioned both at the beginning and end of the book, says that the kind of what political theology would like to accomplish is decontestation. That is, to end the argument, to say we found bedrock, we found the anchor, we don't have to argue anymore. We finally got a solid foundation under us. He knows, and I know, and we know, that that's a utopian dream. The argument never ends. And it's exhausting, and maybe that's part of the appeal of the populist, is to say the argument's over. I'll tell you what's what. In democracy, and this is one thing that Schmitt hated about it, which probably they say constitutional republics, the goal is depoliticization. That is to take these kinds of things out of decision. That is, if we have the rules in place, we have the institutions in place, then procedure should solve all of our problems. This is exactly illustrated by the whole post-electoral system in America. If we follow procedure, then people vote, the state legislatures certify, the electors meet and vote, the Congress counts the votes, the president is elected. But all of those, as we said at the beginning, are human-made steps that at any point can be reversed or overturned or, made an exception. And so there's a point of decision at each of those steps. Inevitably, you can't avoid that. So procedure can never totally do away with the decision. And as we're seeing, in 2020 and early 2021, decision is still a possibility. Decision could still reverse any of these procedural things that have happened before. So Schmitt, what Schmitt is saying, and thinking about political theology through Trump, using Trump as a lens to think about politics and political theology, is that norms, laws, traditions, all of this stuff on which we depend, and which, if they were working perfectly, would simply provide the procedure, the process by which we arrive at our positions. We wouldn't have to make decisions if we simply followed the process. They're always vulnerable. They're always fragile and delicate. They're always susceptible to a will. That could be the God's will, the sovereign's will, a shaman or trickster, anybody's will potentially. We cannot remove will from this equation. Laws and all of their other political forms are always man-made. And that means, of course, we made them, we can change them, we can unmake them, we can make something else. And always the question will remain, it can never be eliminated, by what right? Who are you to make that decision? Why that particular decision? And laws cannot defend themselves. And we've seen that all too clearly. No one is going, the Hatch Act is not going to go and arrest Ivanka Trump. Laws don't have that kind of power. Even the Constitution is just a passive piece of paper unless people act. And therefore, I think the ultimate message, and I say this in the book, is that if you're going to ask what would constrain a sovereign, and this I think is the political theological question, there are three possibilities. Respect for the laws. And of course, that's an anthropological question because that's enculturation, that's learning. For us, culture is the learned and the shared. If people learn and internalize those laws and institutions, then they're fairly safe. But if someone doesn't, other branches of the government and other agencies, Congress, I suppose, could send over sergeants at arms and arrest Ivanka Trump. It would be a constitutional crisis, but they could do it. The military could say no. Trump's own agencies could say no. And there's been a lot of study about how, executive agencies have lost their morale. A lot of people have just resigned because they can't take it, or, they're attacked. So the agencies could respond, but they generally don't. And if they don't, there's no response. And of course, finally, popular opinion. So the media and ultimately elections, pretty much for the last 2 years, non-Trump supporters have been sitting back saying, well, we can finally get rid of him in 2020. Well, hopefully. But in the meantime, basically kind of surrendering. We can't do anything. We have no power, no mechanism until the election. And as we see, even the election itself is not a secure mechanism. There's lots of points of decision in there. And we'll see if any of them actually end up working. If Schmidt is correct, and he probably is correct about this, that sovereignty comes down to the leader's will to make decisions. And the only thing that can resist is an equal and opposite will. And I guess the only equal and opposite will in America is, the plebiscite, the electoral will, the popular will, the democratic will. We'll see about that. Thank you all for joining me. Used up pretty much all of our time. I don't know if we have a question or two, but the book is available on the Global Center for Research, Religion Research website and on Amazon. I hope you will take a look at it. I hope that it does spark some interesting thoughts for you and add something to the literature. There's a lot of work out there on Trump, but I think that this political theological angle is a different one from what I've seen. And I hope that it really does add something to the discussion, not about Trump, because Trump, either today or someday, will be passed. But the issues of where power comes from, about how vulnerable institutions are, those will remain forever. And I hope that we can think about those in new and productive ways.
Dr. Eller, thank you so much for this presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. If I do realize that a lot of people may have places that they need to go, so I will just pop this up real quick on my screen one more time for anybody interested, and then I can get to some Q&A just a little bit with whatever time we have left. But again, if you are interested, GCRR is offering the book $4 off if you just go to gcrr.org and then enter in the promo code IFollowEller. At the end at checkout, you can get the book there. Also, if you would like an autographed copy of the book, then send us an email. So don't place an order yet. Send us an email at info@gcrr.org. You can see it right there. info@gcrr.org, and just request an autographed copy, and Dr. L will be happy to send you one personally. With that said, thanks again for everybody who did show up and stuck it out with us. There were a couple of questions that I'm going to try and get through. We have a ton of questions. I was getting a lot of personal questions sent directly to me, either through my phone, because people found me on Facebook, or they were sending it directly to me in the chat box. So real quick, Dr. Eller, is the PowerPoint presentation, are you willing to make that available to everybody? If we put it on
Yeah, I'll convert that into a PDF because it's smaller, and I will send that to you so you can post it on the website wherever you want to.
That'd be great. Thank you. And I'll send an email out to everybody with that link as well. Real quick, and keep your answers brief. That way, maybe I can get it through as many questions as I can. Your book talks a lot about how Trump is not really exceptional, that this is kind of part and parcel of being a dictator in a way, or the rise of one. Is there anything that did strike you, though, as very unique about Trump and his approach to becoming the authoritarian leader?
You know, I think one of the conclusions that I came to is that as far as Populist goes, he's actually a pretty weak one. In fact, various people have said that he's, kind of a lazy executive, and thank goodness. He doesn't take much interest in governing. I think that the only thing that makes Trump as fascinating as he is that he's such an exception to the American sort of expectation. I think that if people had a better sense of what, populists have been doing since the 90s, they would really say that Trump is a latecomer, a fairly weenie populist, quite honestly, and somebody who I think that he probably won't have much long-term effect except for setting a precedent. That is, I think I talked at the very beginning about how he has kind of thrown back the curtain and, opened the hood and shown us things. And I'm not the first person to say that the next populist won't be nearly as benign as he is. Somebody who's got more energy, who's got more understanding of things, who's probably actually a little more evil, could get a lot more done, because he's shown just how passive, how almost moribund, our institutions can be, and how people who do follow the rules, and Democrats, in Congress tend to be a little more, obedient to the traditions and the procedures. They don't know how to respond to this. I think that all of us have spent the last four years asking, how in the world do we respond to this? And no one has come up with a good idea. We're just waiting it out, basically. So I think that, again, his most interesting point is the contrast to kind of our American sense of things, and what it means for others who could pick up this model and advance it in much scarier ways than he has.
So, if you will, a lot of liberal reactions in calling him a dictator and a soon-to-be dictator and a tyrant, that might be more alarmist than reality because he's a bit more impotent, but he has set the blueprint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's shown that a populist can really get pretty far in America. Mm-hmm. Something you said I wanted to respond to, and I forgot what it was already. Say the beginning of that again.
Alarmist.
Say again?
The liberal reactions of him being a dictator and a tyrant is more alarmist than based in reality because he's impotent.
Yeah, I've forgotten what I was going to respond to, but let's go on. Hopefully it'll come back to me.
One of our attendees asked, is there any society, ancient or modern, that's ever existed that didn't have a religious grounding to it, or more of a mythological and cultic grounding to it? Because obviously the United States was supposed to be kind of, but it really didn't, since Puritanism was such a part of our DNA right from the beginning.
I think that in the anthropological record, there's a couple of cases of things of societies that verge on having nothing that really is recognizably religious. The two examples I can think of are the Bakhtiari in kind of the Iranian mountains, who seem to just have no interest whatsoever in such questions, and the Abudi Pygmies in the Congo. The only thing that they seem to have that was close to a supernatural belief was that the forest itself was alive. And that the forest could get angry and punish them, and that they had to essentially sing to pacify the forest. Most societies do think that there was a mythological time. I'm thinking, for example, of the wall. Some of you have probably heard the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming or the dream time. That in the beginning there were, and again, there's no concept of like creation ex nihilo. The world's already here and the ancestors are already here. But the spirits came out of the ground and did things, had various adventures and did things, and they, in their actions, created the landscape and the society, the social rules, institutions. And that's why we have them today. So that's not a political thing exactly, but it does speak to the political theological question fundamentally of what are we supposed to do and why, and where did it come from and what's the authority of it. And in that case, it's the ancestors, it's nature itself kind of personified. But I would say in almost all, at best a handful of examples, in almost all societies, there's at least some kind of non-human, other than human, superhuman kind of personhood that is providing, once again, the bedrock for human society.
A metaphysical, if you will, a metaphysical basis.
Sure, why not?
Okay. Now, going back to the idea that oftentimes traditionally sovereigns have also been thought to rule by divine right. In your research, have you found any indication that Trump himself thinks of him as divine or ruling by divine right? I get that he uses a lot of religious jargon for rhetoric and for political purposes. Is there any indication that he actually thinks he might be divine or ruling by divine right?
Well, first of all, I might question one of your premises that he uses a lot of religious jargon. I think he's probably the least religious in his jargon of any recent president. Biden uses more religious jargon than Trump does, and certainly Bush did. I think that he thinks he's really a super person. Does he think he's divine or supernatural? I mean, I think that one thing I've learned in the last 4 years is that any kind of attempt to plumb Trump's mind is almost entirely a waste of time. I have no idea what he's thinking, and neither does anyone else. But I tend to think that he doesn't think consistently, so probably there isn't a consistent pattern of his thought. I doubt it. I don't think it goes that far. I think that he just thinks he's like the smartest person in the world and the best person in the world, and that's probably enough for him, quite honestly. I've never really heard any indication that would make him think that I think he's willing to let others think that. He's willing to play with that, but I doubt it. And honestly, I don't care what he thinks about that.
So going back to this concept of him thinking that he is basically a Superman, a lot of prominent psychologists have labeled him a malignant narcissist. Now, and I think there's a lot of validity to this diagnosis. So, how much do you think that might be playing into this? And is he kind of falling ass backwards into an authoritarian position because of the narcissism, as opposed to it being a deliberate strategy of his to be the authoritarian?
Well, again, yeah. I'm not a psychologist, so I specifically, avoid any kind of psychological analysis in the book and in most of the things that I say. And even I think most psychologists and psychiatrists have said that, absent actually, a clinical interview, they don't want to get into diagnosis and such. I think he is a narcissist. I think that probably drives more of his policies than anything else. But I think a lot of that probably comes from, first of all, his upbringing, where he came from an elite family, so he was raised to be a narcissist. And I think probably to be a New York City property developer takes a fair amount of narcissism. I think I think that what we have maybe more than anything else is, a CEO. In power, and those kind of people have tremendous self-confidence. All political leaders and all the scholars are narcissists to a certain degree. It's narcissistic of me to think that the 30, 40 of you ought to sit and listen to me. But I think that he's definitely got a sense that, and not only that that he's really special and great, but he's had a whole lifetime of, kind of hate to admit, of winning, of being taken to court and winning, of getting into, business deals and winning. He's used to trampling over things. And so he runs the country the way he ran his business, which is, as the CEO and, sole officer, I can do whatever I want. He doesn't understand that, a president isn't a CEO. who has total power. And maybe if Trump Enterprises were a public company, he would have learned a little different lesson. But I think he brings a lot of that kind of business attitude with him, which explains as much about his administration as any political, and certainly probably any theological inclinations he might have.
Interesting. And we'll only take a couple more minutes. I know a lot of people have to go and we're over our time. But kind of going back to this notion, you had described Trump as an elite, as part of the elite, as the East Coast elite. But one of our attendees kind of pushes back on that and says, actually, he's not elite. He's just rich, but the elite hate him. Do you find any truth to that at all?
Well, I mean, I think when people use elite in America, they tend to mean the educated, like professors and stuff, telling them what to do, experts and things. I mean, he's nouveau riche, I suppose, in that sense, and the old, I suppose, Hampton crowd, hates that kind of thing. But he's elite. I mean, there's no reason to beat around the bush about that. In fact, I live in Denver, but I was raised in upstate New York. I lived there until 1990, so I knew Trump, not personally, obviously, but I was very well aware of Trump in the 70s and the 80s. I saw him in action then. And I remember there was some kind of a TV show about him and his life. I guess it was might have actually been before Melania, maybe after Marla Maples, I think it was. And he was showing his home in Trump Tower, which was literally gilded gold. And I thought, this is the perfect image of the nouveau riche, of the ugly elite who, the true elites, they're not ostentatious like that. This is the insecure elite trying to prove something. And, various people have said that he actually was born in and raised in one of the kind of, lesser areas of New York City, that he's been fighting his whole life to kind of escape that kind of humble New York, origin and to be one of the elites. But he doesn't know how to do it. So he does it in a very clumsy and, again, ostentatious way that, the Vanderbilts and whatever would look at it, and the Carnegies and say, that pretender. So I think there's a lot of insecurities that go back to, I hate to reduce everything to childhood, but I think he's got a lot of insecurities, from that, and between that and his, again, professional CEO job of, I hate to badmouth real estate developers, but professional lying has made a career out of that kind of thing. Salesmen, lie. That's their job, and he's largely a salesman for himself. And in that book that I mentioned, the Prophets of Deceit, they describe the educator as a salesman. Again, as a comment, who is lying all the time for their own benefit. And if you get something out of it too, fantastic, but it's not really about you.
Thank you for that. There's an intriguing question here, kind of on a broader scale. It says, it's often claimed that American society resembles more of an oligarchy, perhaps, than democracy. Could you speak to the oligarchy in America and its relation to political theology?
Sure. That's an interesting question, because in a way, Trump is part of the oligarchy, and in a way, he's not. Obviously, the oligarchy in America, since, who was it? Teddy Roosevelt or someone said that, the business of America is business. The oligarchy is, perfectly non-theological in America. Sometimes they're a little bit, old school Protestant. But there's really no religion in that at all. It's entirely power based on money. It's entirely power based on industrial positions and such. So Trump is that. But also, and this is what's so particularly interesting about him, is that he is that, but he rails against that in a twisted way. So I suppose the oligarchy too is, against the American people. Certainly, people like Jeff Bezos and, certainly George Soros, and Bill Gates, all the liberal oligarchs are against him. So I probably wouldn't, I wouldn't put them in a theology anywhere. And I think the oligarchy has tended to eschew explicit political power and to wield more kind of soft cultural power underneath. I don't think that Jeff Bezos wants to be president, for example. And I think, for example, that if Trump were smarter, he wouldn't have wanted to be president either. I think that Trump wanted to be president because it was just, like the last thing he hadn't done, sort of. And it was just a kind of a point of pride for him to do that. But I think that there are lots of, more than political theology, and I talk about this briefly in the book, I think maybe a better way to think about that would be what we've called, since Michel Foucault coined the term, governmentality. That is, there are lots of ways to exercise power besides government. And there are lots of sites of power besides government. Government is one form of governmentality, but corporations are another. And obviously, hospitals are another. In fact, Foucault kind of cut his teeth on this, talking about mental institutions and the way they control people, literally strapping them down. So if we think about all the ways that people can exercise power, and in that sense, if the basic question of political theology is power, absolutely. All the ways you can exercise power short of, in fact, better not in government. Government is way too, public and conspicuous. It's way too, contentious. There are lots of other subtler and calmer ways to exercise power than that. And I think the smart ones, and something we probably should say about Trump too, which I think is phenomenally important, he loves chaos and conflict, more than anybody I've ever heard of or seen. So the fact that people are fighting with him, I think that just makes his day. It just absolutely gets his motor running. I think other, the gentler oligarchs don't want to get into those kind of fights. So there are lots of other ways for them to transmit their influence. Jeff Bezos can get a lot of stuff done. Again, Jeff Bezos will be here long after Trump is, and he'll probably actually shape America a lot more than Trump does. So if we think of some combination of political theology and governmentality, I think that, that we have to bring in the oligarchy, and the oligarchy makes a lot more sense to us.
Let me ask one more question. We have time for one more. And this question is specifically about your book. It asks, does your book go into historical insights on ways societies have successfully removed power from a populist movement?
It does, in the chapter on populists, where I talk about Fujimori and Bolsonaro, I mean, some of them, unfortunately, are in power now and have not been removed. But there have been some cases, and it's interesting. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. I remember now. What's really interesting about Trump, and this actually maybe speaks about this question too. What's interesting about Trump the populist, Trump the authoritarian, even in this post-election debacle, is that he's still largely operating within the institutions. He's still trying to get state legislatures to do something, or the electors to do something, or the Congress to do something. He's not just literally sending in the troops. So he hasn't gone all the way to an authoritarian who says, to hell with the institution. I'm going to just do this on my own and with whatever force I can muster. I don't know if that's just a lack of imagination. He doesn't realize he could at least try to do that. Maybe he realizes he doesn't have really the support, or the military won't go for it. Maybe he just doesn't want to push it that far. But there have been populists, again, who've gone much further than him by literally saying, I don't care about the institutions, and I'm either going to just bend them or I'm going to just totally ignore them. Fujimori was a case where he tried to literally declare himself dictator. That's a bridge too far, obviously. You can dictate a lot without declaring yourself one. And so the question now is, could Trump or someone do that? That's, I think, the precedent that he set, that people realize that the system can't respond very well, and that quite possibly somebody could push it even further. And the exact question that you asked just now was what again?
Does your book go into
cases? Okay, there have been cases where, and this is again, America hasn't risen up to this point, maybe because Trump hasn't pushed them to this point, where they literally did arrest, the populist. Fujimori is a case where he was about to be arrested and he fled the country, and they tried him and convicted him in absentia. And he finally did come back to the country and literally did serve time in prison. So yeah, there have been countries who have finally rallied and energized their institutions to use them against the populist, to finally use the courts or use the legislature or use the Constitution to finally disempower, and sometimes literally to imprison the populist. It has been done, fairly rare, but it has been done. And the current generation of populists is so recent they're still in power now, and maybe they've learned a lesson about not pushing it that far. But none of them have gone that far yet. And I think a lot of it has to do with, again, bigger world historical things, because a lot of what's driving populism today is the sense, not just in America, in Hungary, in Russia, again, that things aren't going our way anymore, that we need to do something to revive things. And the populists tend to have success temporarily with that, whether it's with, tax breaks or, neoliberalism, whatever. They tend to have short-term success, so they tend to be quite popular for a while, but that always runs out. Whether it's Hugo Chavez or everybody else, you can't prop up a system indefinitely. And so when the people turn against them, often they get voted out after 2 or 3 terms. Or if they're like a Putin, somehow they just hang around forever. Or in very rare cases, the system does finally rise up against them. So there are a few precedents, but I think that America, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, is far from being pushed to that point by a Trump. So we're far from actually taking that kind of immune response to a Trump.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eller, for this presentation. It's wonderful, and it's such a fascinating and insightful book. I genuinely believe that your book is going to go down as one of the foremost authoritative and important books about this era that we just went through, and about the risks that we as an institution, as a country, have in the future to come. So thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you for presenting. I want to say thank you to everybody who came in attendance tonight. I will be in touch via email just to offer some options for getting the PowerPoint, and of course for getting Dr. Eller's recorded Zoom presentation to you as well. And again, if you're interested in the book, all you have to go to is gcrr.org, and you'll find the book right there on the home page. And there's the coupon code I Follow Eller. So we hope that you get it. Give us some feedback on it as well once you've had a chance to read it. Again, thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.